and welcome to Basic Folk, a podcast where we have honest conversations with folk musicians. I am your host, Cindy Howes, and today we're talking to Johnathan Rice. More about what we talk about after we thank our sponsors for Basic Folk. Basic Folk receives support from McDean, songwriters who love each other. McDean would be delighted to send you a free CD of their first EP, The Sampler Plate. Email lin@mcdean.co, lin@mcdean.co to get one. The Scottish-American songwriter Johnathan Rice, he might have first landed on your radar through his duo Jenny and Johnny with his former partner Jenny Lewis, who he also would make music with into her solo career, very big part of each other's musical career. Johnathan Rice's story starts in Virginia and Scotland, where he spent time going back and forth for his dad's work. Each place had its own effect on his young musicianship. For example, Virginia embodied a typical mid-90s American teen experience where he loved Nirvana, actually had a first-hand encounter with drummer Dave Grohl, who lived nearby. In Scotland, Johnathan was surrounded by a huge family where music was front and center, and it wasn't uncommon for the family to gather. And Johnathan, after spending tons of time practicing for the moment, would perform in front of his first audiences, his Scottish family. Johnathan discusses his early connections to the Saddle Creek music scene, which revolved around Conor Oberst of the group Bright Eyes, who he claims Conor very much influenced his writing early on. Also talks about his 12-year relationship with Jenny Lewis and how his latest album, The Long Game, was inspired by times during their relationship, during the breakup, and the aftermath. And recently, this is very interesting, Johnathan has become known for his Instagram haikus, which he has published a book for, and it fills up most of his Instagram feed. And he talks about the hilarious haikus that he writes and the origin of the reason why he writes those. It's a real pleasure getting to know Johnathan during this interview. He's kind, attentive, generous. He has a great dry sense of humor in his delivery, which shows up in his writing. A case in point, the song Meet the Mother from The Long Game was inspired by an encounter he had with Bill Murray, like a conversation he had with Bill Murray, where Bill Murray just kind of mutters, "Oh, well, you got to meet the mother." And then Johnathan wrote a song about it. So we'll hear a clip of that song, and then we'll get to our conversation with Johnathan Rice on Basic Folk.
You got to meet the mother before you kiss the bride, before you take the longest ride, before the rice and flowers fly. You've got to meet the mother before you kiss the bride, and see where she got those big brown eyes, those long, long legs, that sense of style, or a streak of madness 10 miles wide. You've got to meet the mother before you kiss the bride. You could discover the cruelty.
Johnathan Rice, thanks so much for talking to me.
My pleasure.
So you were born in Virginia, but you went back and forth between there and Glasgow, where your parents are from. How did you take all that traveling when you were young, and like how did that work out, and how long would you spend in each place?
It really varied, the amount of time that we spent in either country. I spent the majority of my life in the States, but I spent some formative years in Scotland and many formative times in my life in Scotland. It's just the nature of what my dad did for a living. And
what was that?
He basically he started as a speechwriter in Washington, D.C., and then he would take the occasional sabbatical and work in Scotland.
Would he write speeches for politicians?
Not politicians per se, but leaders of major institutions, non-governmental institutions. Yeah, he taught me how to write. You know, not necessarily poetic prose, but I was always watching him at his desk writing.
Would you learn from him by osmosis, or would you actually like ask him specifically like for feedback?
Well, he was very hands-on. Him and my mother were very hands-on with my education, so anything that I wrote would be proofread and kind of it'd be graded by them before it went to my teacher, you know.
So I read that each place that you would spend time in made its own impact on you, and I'm interested to know what role the FM radio played for you in Virginia, and like what time period were you listening to the radio?
Well, I was born in the mid-'80s, so the radio was a big part of life. But I'm trying to remember, and music was a huge part of my life. My parents were really, really passionate music listeners, but specifically the FM radio, when I started to branch out on my own, I think it was the beginning of what they would call the modern rock format. And that was just basically whatever bands they were playing on MTV, they were also playing on the radio, as far as I could tell.
Was that like the mid to late 90s?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's around the time I became conscious of my own taste. And I loved Nirvana just like everyone else, and we all knew that Dave Grohl was from down the street from where we lived in Northern Virginia.
Oh, whoa.
But I went to play street hockey, very authentically, with my friend Tommy in Springfield, Virginia. And my favorite band, by such a long shot, was Nirvana, and probably the Beastie Boys after that. And my cousins in Scotland my older cousins, who I thought were so cool, gave me a mixtape with the Beastie Boys and Nirvana on it. So I considered myself very hip. And I was playing street hockey with Tommy, and he said, you know, the drummer from Nirvana, he lives just right over there. And he pointed at this house at the end of the cul-de-sac. And I said, yeah, right. No, he does not. And he said, yeah, he does. How much you want to bet? And I was like, you know, neither one of us had any hard currency at that point. But anyway, we went over to the house, and we knocked on the door, and just inexplicably, Dave Grohl answered the door.
Shut up. No way.
Absolutely. And this has been... I've actually had the opportunity, because I've led a blessed and extraordinary life. I've had the opportunity to corroborate this with the man himself. And me and Tommy are standing there, and, you know, when you're a kid, everything feels like a bit of a fairy tale anyway. So, you know, Tommy was right, and I was very impressed. But he was off tour with Nirvana. This was during the Nevermind era. And he was off tour, and he was just hanging out with his friends that he grew up with, and visiting his mother, but he was playing a guitar, and I couldn't understand why he was playing an acoustic guitar. And I said, you're a drummer, you're not supposed to, do you also play the guitar? I didn't know that you could do both, you know. And he's like, yeah, I like to play the guitar too.
At that point, were you playing guitar?
I was already playing, yeah.
So then did that put a thought in your mind of like, oh, I can play other instruments?
It did, but I never actually really learned to play any other instruments. I fooled around on them, but I probably should have taken more inspiration from Dave Grohl than I actually did.
I've heard he's like the nicest person.
That was certainly my experience. It's always been my experience through the years and the brief moments I've spent with him. Yeah.
Oh, that's so cool. Your accent is very interesting, I imagine, like going back and forth between Virginia and Glasgow.
Yeah.
I wonder if and being around, you know, if you spend a lot of time in Glasgow, does your accent come back?
Sure. Yeah, definitely. And even if I call my parents and talk to them for a while, you know.
In Glasgow, you were around a lot of people making music. Is that true?
Yeah, well, I would say that it's just a very casually musical culture. The Scottish culture and the Irish culture as well. And the way that people speak, just the way that people speak to one another, I find to be very lyrical and musical. People are always playing with their language. They're playing with versions of slang and almost like a patois of sorts. They call it Glaswegian. And it's a very playful, idiosyncratic way of speaking.
Can you give an example?
Well, if you want someone not to do something, you wouldn't say, don't do that. You say, go no de that.
I barely understood that.
All right, mate, go no do that. Just go no, okay. So, something like that. And yeah, it becomes so rapid fire, and especially if there's alcohol involved, it just becomes unintelligible to the outsider. But anyway, there were always gatherings. I had come from a big family, a big, Catholic Scottish family, and there's just always these nights where everyone's together, and it just happens very naturally that a guitar comes out and people sing their song, and you're kind of expected to be able to sing your party piece when your time comes up, and then, as your personality is forming, if you're a kid, and I always remember really liking the way that it felt for people to sing for people. I always got a real charge out of it, and really enjoyed it. And I learned a lot of old Scottish and Irish music because of the old people that would sing. My grandmother would sing a song and that she had learned from her grandmother, and learned songs that were part of the IRA resistance. Those kind of songs, political songs about the Catholic genocide, and songs about striking miners and striking weavers. Folk music, really. And the same kind of folk music, I think, that inspired people like Woody Guthrie and Bob Dylan, really all ancient music in a way.
So how did those family gatherings affect your confidence in your own musical skills?
Well, it was the first audience I ever played for. It was the first people I ever played. I wasn't playing original material. I was just, I would, if there was a family gathering coming up, there'd be something to look forward to, be something to practice for.
So I've noticed that you have a pretty stunning vocabulary just over, reading interviews that you've done, and wondering what has been the evolution of your connection to words. And also, when did you think to set words to music?
I was always pretty into words, and I think having a father who was a writer, my mother is also a voracious reader. My mother used to read the dictionary at night. My dad traveled a lot, and sometimes my mother and I would sit in my mother's bed and read the dictionary with her.
That's so adorable and nerdy.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I don't know if whatever floats your boat, it really floated mine.
The dictionary gives you a real thrill.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it does. It does. And then when I remember I used the word flabbergasted in an early, like a second grade story that we were writing, and the teacher was like, "How'd you learn flabbergasted?" I was like, "It was in the dictionary. You should check it out."
Check out the dictionary. Tell me about the story about how you decided to pick up the guitar.
Well, my father had a guitar. He had a Yamaha. I used to just open up his case and take the guitar out and strum it before I knew any chords. I just liked the way that it looked. I liked the way that it smelled. I liked the way the case smelled. I liked to take the guitar out of the case and climb into the case and sit in the case.
Like a cat.
Yeah, like a cat. I guess I also apparently spent a lot of time in the dryer.
Like a cat.
Which, maybe accounts for my sense of humor.
Very dry. I get it.
Bad pun, and it won't be the last. It won't be the last during our brief time together. But yeah, I just always loved the guitar. I saw that it was a way that my dad would kind of relax when he got home from work. He would play the guitar for half an hour or an hour or something some nights, and I just loved the way that it sounded. It was a very magical looking object to me. So my dad got me, I think, my first guitar when I was around 9.
Did you have to ask him, or did he just get it for you?
I can't remember if I asked or he just got it from me. We always just would go into... I'm the oldest of 4 children, and he was a music junkie, so we would just go to used CD stores on the weekend, music shops, guitar shops. We were always there. We were always around music and musical instruments. So I can't remember if asking for it. I remember wanting one. but he got me a cheap little, kind of almost like a plywood guitar, like a real beginner's guitar. And he got me some lessons. That I would go to weekly lessons, which were not as enjoyable as learning songs by memory at home and stuff. But
Right. Can you talk about when you were 16 years old? I read that you discovered your singing voice.
yeah, I think probably what happened is I was just trying to imitate the singers that I loved, which at that time, around 16, I was starting to discover like British folk music. Not the older folk music that we were discussing earlier, but more the 60s and 70s.
Like Fairport Convention.
Fairport Convention, Nick Drake, that kind of stuff. Even Bert Jansch and
That, you know, the light, joyful music.
yeah, I mean, to me, it always made me feel joyful, or not. I don't know about joyful, but like, it just made me feel a certain way, and I liked it. But yeah, I think I was just probably trying to imitate, and I was also trying to sound older than I was. So because I thought that would make me sound more authentic. So when I listened to my first record now, which was made when I was like 19, and 20 years old, vocally I'm like, oh boy, it sounds like it really feels affected to me in a way.
Yeah.
And as I've gone on, as I've just become more comfortable in my skin, which I think is, if you're lucky enough to live, to stay alive, you hopefully become more comfortable in the skin, not less. Yeah, I think I've kind of gotten closer in the way that I sing now. It's closer to the way that I speak.
And you account that just to being comfortable.
And, to playing all over the world for half my life.
Have you ever heard singers talk about how they really were able to learn how to sing because of like having like a good monitor in front of them so that they can hear what it sounds like?
I believe them. I have no reason to disbelieve that, but that's certainly, I wouldn't cite that as, for me, it's more if I can center myself and be present in the performance, whether it's in the studio or in front of people, I can connect with something. And that to me is where, in that moment of connection, that's where I'm growing as a performer or as a musician or as a vocalist, whatever you want to call it.
You decided that you weren't going to go to college, and your parents said, okay, you have 1 year to go and do music. How did that conversation go?
Well, it was much louder than that. And there were many of them, and they all were varying degrees, very painful. Look, my parents are working class people. They came from very little in Glasgow. And my father worked very, very hard to make this incredible journey to America. We are one of those families. Despite the color of our skin and everything, we are very much a part of that American immigrant story. And he basically took us up a couple notches on the ladder up into this middle-class existence and all of the privilege that comes with that. And we grew up being very aware of that, or at least I did. And I always loved school. I took it very seriously. I took my education very seriously. I took reading very seriously. And I wanted, for a very long time, to lead an academic life and then find a profession that was simpatico with that, like law or some field of social justice or something. But then, and this is going to sound, it's too much like a Lifetime movie or something. What happened was, do you know what early acceptance is?
At college?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was in my senior year of high school. I went to an all-boy Jesuit school in Washington, D.C. called Gonzaga College High School. But I went to the school. It was very rigorous, very well-respected place where, like presidential candidates and mayors and all this, it's like a prep school. And I committed to go to the University of Edinburgh. I wanted to move back to Scotland and study political science. in Edinburgh, and I basically committed to go there in, I think it was October or November of my last year in high school, my senior year. And someone explained to me, because again, I'm the first of 4 children. I was the guinea pig for my family in terms of the American educational system. We didn't know a lot about the whole college admissions process or anything like that. And my buddy explained to me, he said, your early decision, you already got in. He's like, do you know how lucky you are? I was like, what do you mean? And he said, you don't have to get good grades anymore. And I was like, that can't be true. That doesn't sound right. I don't know if I want to get bad grades. And he's like, you don't want to get bad grades, but you don't have to push yourself. This is the type of school where you get like 4 hours of homework a night,
Oh, yeah.
You got no social life type of thing, which I quite liked, I must say. Anyway, I checked around with another few people, and I even went up to one of the higher ups. I went to a guidance counselor. I was like, is it true that my transcript from this point on will not be delivered to my college that I'm going to? And he basically said, yes, but don't like start flunking out of your classes. Like, don't throw away. I was like, I'm not going to do that. He said, if you dip below a C, they might let them know. And I said, okay. So I was like, if I can just get C's, I can focus more on playing the guitar all the time. And really what happened then, and this is the part that sounds too much like a bad movie or something, but I started smoking weed. And I had always been afraid to. And I had always been so scared of it. And I'd been the first child. I wanted to be like the good kid, good student, good son. And I started smoking dope in my parents' basement and listening to records in a whole different way, feeling music in a whole different way, and writing lyrics in a very kind of freer way than I had before. And basically, all the rumors are true. Drugs will stop you from achieving the goals that you set out for yourself. No, I'm kind of joking, but it is true. And I started thinking a little bit differently, and I started feeling a little more like, I guess I felt more like an artist than I did a student. And I was already playing around with my band in high school. I was already doing things, but I just had never considered it a career. And then I met some people who had made the leap. They had just moved to New York and started playing out in the clubs and stuff like that. And I had read some biographies of some other musicians who'd done the same. And I was just like, man, it's not some remote thing. You can actually do this. And I just announced to my parents, I just said, I don't think I'm going to go to college this year. I think I'm going to move up to New York. I'm going to make an EP with my buddies in Richmond, Virginia. And I'm going to try and get a record deal with a major label. I'm going to move to New York. And it was like a death in the family.
Oof.
It was terrible news. I was setting a terrible example, and they were just worried for me out of love, which is understandable. I'm grateful for that. But there was just something in me, I think, that just refused to let go of that. And so I spent the summer working construction and whatever, waiting tables and all that stuff, and got a few $1,000s saved and moved up to New York on the 9th of September 2001.
Oh, yeah. 2 days before September 11th, which is like, my gosh. So what was your impression of moving to New York versus like what the reality was like, particularly during that insane time?
Well, yeah, I will never know what New York was like before 9/11. I just got there. I just got there. I can remember everything about September 9th and 10th. I can remember that the weather was beautiful. I just couldn't believe my luck. I lived in a tiny apartment on the Upper West Side, and then the attacks happened basically a day and a half into my tenure there.
Wow.
And I'll never forget that. And it's impossible not to internalize that experience. But as tragic as it was and is, it was also extraordinary in terms of the way that people were kind to one another and the way that people treated each other.
So how did your New York life in the early days prepare you for the rest of your career? How did you feel set up after that?
I think what happened is I was just very fortunate to meet some real artists who were making a living being artists. And I was so young and so green and so impressionable that if I hadn't met those people and they hadn't influenced me in such a way, I would have turned out a lot differently. But I met Jesse Harris, who's a songwriter from New York City. And through Jesse, I met Conor Oberst and a few other songwriters. And they really became my core group of friends for the next half of my life.
Yeah, and it sounds like Jesse was the one that kind of connected you to that. I mean, this is skipping ahead a little bit, but just to briefly state, you were ready to go to college after you were in New York for a year, but then you got a call from Reprise Records in 2002, and then you were really thoughtful before you signed, which I'm really impressed with, instead of just like jumping at it.
Oh, no. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I said that self-consciously in an interview or something. But no, as I remember it, I just couldn't believe that it was real. You know, I had made this EP in my friend's house in Virginia, and I took like 1,000 copies of that EP with me to New York to sell at my shows. Now, somehow one of the EP copies ended up with this manager, Lori Levy, in Los Angeles. And she sent it to an A&R man named Perry Watts Russell, who was departing from Capitol and about to begin his career at Warner Reprise. And he got it. And he's like, oh, yeah, sounds like something that I would sign. And I had run out of money in New York City. I was back to waiting tables in Virginia, and I was getting ready to go to college in the fall. And he offered me a record deal. They flew me out to Los Angeles, where I had never been before. And I flew to Los Angeles when I was shortly after my 19th birthday. And I remember calling my parents from the Standard Hotel, where I lived for a couple of weeks on the Sunset Strip. Didn't know a single soul in Los Angeles. I remember calling my dad and said, well, they're offering me a record deal, and I've also hired an attorney, and the attorney is going to explain to you that it's not a lie, you know?
I hired an attorney to talk to you.
Well, in a way, I was just like, just so you know, like this is a real thing. No one's trying to take advantage of me.
Yeah.
I mean, record labels are always trying to take advantage of you, but
yeah.
Not on the face of it. But and we all collectively as a family, we just couldn't believe it. It was exactly what I wanted. But I can't say that there was any intelligent strategy behind it. It was just sheer luck and coincidence and good fortune. And so basically what happened then is they gave me a chunk of change, which was more money than I'd ever seen in my life. And I used that money not just to record and learn how to be a musician in the studio, but it meant that I didn't have to get a job and work. And I basically spent the next couple of years learning how to live as an artist on my own.
Can you talk about how that Saddle Creek scene and the Conor Oberst scene helped shape you as an artist?
Well, it definitely did. And I was very inspired, particularly by Conor, because I met Conor on his 22nd birthday. And I knew about his music. I already had his music, but we became friends very quickly. And you just couldn't not admire the kid. He was just doing it all on his own terms. Completely on his own terms. Him and all of his friends. And just as a writer, he was so advanced that he didn't really feel like a peer to me. And I was writing very melodic songs, and the melodies were coming easier to me, but the lyrics, I think I would often just paint by numbers with the lyrics. When I met Connor, that no longer became acceptable to me because he was taking such chances as a lyricist. He was so daring and so original. And then, there would be these nights where, everyone would have a guitar, similar to the nights that I spoke about earlier with my parents' friends as a child, but this is more of my peer group. So it's myself, Conor Oberst, Jenny Lewis, Dave Dondero, Ben Queller, whoever might be there on a given night in the East Village or in Brooklyn, and everyone, and you're expected to sing your song. Well, I didn't want to sing some song that had Moon and June lyrics. And I didn't want to, I wanted to go toe to toe, but I think I was still much greener than them. They were a bit older than me. They had done more touring, they'd done more recording, and they were just very much following their own star artistically. And I definitely became instantly aware of that and wanted to learn from them as much as possible.
That's so cool. Now, Johnathan, I have a couple questions about the 12-year relationship that you had with Jenny, but nothing personal. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Okay. So you met Jenny Lewis from being around that Saddle Creek scene. And your new record, The Long Game, is about the end of that 12-year relationship. And it seems like it was kind of inevitable that you would end up making this record. And I'm wondering, how did you feel about starting this process of creating this record versus how it actually ended up for you internally in terms of was it daunting to begin with and then it turned out differently?
No, I wouldn't say that it was daunting. It's a record about acceptance. And the thing that I like about this record is that I myself, as the writer, the songs span the time before our relationship ended, before Jenny and I's relationship ended, to the time that it was ending, to after the time to the time after it was over. And then by the end of the record, and at that part of my life by the end of the recording sessions of the record, I was in a new relationship.
I mean, listening to it, it sounds very brave. Do you feel like it was a brave thing to do?
I would be hesitant to call myself brave for writing folk songs. You know what I mean? I think if you're an artist, you gotta write.
I know what you mean, but I think it's these emotions that you're coming head on with. I feel like normal people, quote unquote normal people, would be like, I'm not going to face this, and just sort of tuck it away.
Somebody that I have a lot of respect for, very special person who I don't know very well, but who knows me very well, who was in my life for a very brief period before she completely disappeared. She said, merge with the pain and you'll heal faster.
No follow-up questions. Interview over. Great. That's so good.
So I can't say that I followed that mantra every day or every step of the way, but that's definitely something that's stuck in my mind. And it's something that I strove to do. Wow. In life and in writing and in playing,
Your producer, Tony Berg, who also, I talked to Ethan Gruska on this podcast, and he worked with Tony a lot. Yeah. Tony seems like an awesome person to work with. And he did something interesting where he encouraged you to drop your vocal range. And you were talking about earlier how your singing voice is more like your speaking voice currently. What was that process like for you? And, were you all for this idea before? Had you tapped into that voice?
Yeah, I had been experimenting with it, and there's little flickers of it on other records of using what I would call my baritone register of my voice, which is, like I said earlier, more like how I speak. But Tony saw, when I brought in the song, some of the songs that I brought to Tony were already there, like The Long Game was already in that register. A couple other songs were in that register, but he said, let's let's get all the other songs as close to that as possible. And it sounds so simple, but this is what a good producer does. It's a real simple idea. If you start off low, if you start off nice and low, you have somewhere else to go. So you can add, you can make your song more interesting as it goes on, vocally. Mm-hmm. Simple, but a lot of people sometimes don't do that.
How do you feel like singing in this lower range for all of your songs, since your singing voice is more like your speaking voice? Are you able to connect more emotionally with like who you are as a person while singing these songs?
Absolutely. I definitely just feel very, very much myself. My eyes are open when I sing now. I used to spend years with my eyes closed, as cliche as that sounds. It's very true. I was afraid of the audience in a way. And a lot of that comes from my years with Jenny, because Jenny and I, we weren't just romantically involved, we were musically involved, deeply, deeply musically involved she was involved in my work heavily. I was heavily involved in her solo career from Rabbit Fur Coat all the way through The Voyager. And I had a very strange relationship with her audience. A lot of those kids, Jenny had and has a really, really passionate fan base, which is wonderful. And the majority of them are wonderful people. But Elvis Costello once told Jenny and I, he said, be careful when you mess with other people's fantasies. But what I mean, the reason I point that out is people in the audience knew that I was with Jenny. So there would sometimes be a very jealous or negative reaction from those people.
Yeah. And
even though we were they didn't know what my contributions were or were not to her music. They were just like, is this the guy that's going to break up Rilo Kiley? Is this the guy that's going to like a Yoko trip in the early years? Just stuff like that. So a lot of times I was kind of scared of those kids, and they definitely, for some of the early years when I was younger and more insecure, I think they kind of colored the experience for me. And as a performer, I think I retreated into myself a little bit more.
Wow.
And now that in recent years has just completely melted away, which I'm very grateful for.
Wow. It must feel good to be able to recognize that.
Yeah. And it's also just, again, it's a journey of being comfortable in your own skin.
Totally.
It's not anybody else's fault. It's not some kid in the audience's fault. It's
right.
just it's more about finding yourself, as cheesy as that sounds.
So this kind of plays into the topic of that a little bit. So Tony, your producer, insisted that you build the record around the feeling of aloneness that he heard in the material. And after your relationship with Jenny ended, you spent much of the next year alone. After that experience of being alone, what are your feelings about spending time alone, and how have they changed?
Spending time alone is essential, I think, if you're an artist. It's very clear to me now, and it's nothing that I regret, and I wouldn't change it because I love my life. I'm very grateful for my life and everything that has happened in it. But I merged too closely with Jenny and her work that I neglected my own for some time. And I'm very grateful for the work that Jenny and I did together. I'm very proud of it, and there's so much of it. But it wasn't until I made this record that I really, really got back in touch with my own writing, my own perspective, and what it means to be a performer alone on the stage or alone before a microphone. And that's what Tony wanted from me. It's what he got from the material. And I always wanted to make a record that I could perform all over the world, just me and the guitar. And the hard truth of it and I know it, so I assume everyone else knows it. I never had a group of songs that were good enough to make a record like this, but now I do, or then I had them, you know, and I do believe that every song on this record can stand up, just me and the guitar.
So about writing this record, you said it was probably the most effortless writing process I've experienced because my emotions were very accessible to me. Can you talk more about like what that experience was like for you to have your emotions so out in the open?
It's inescapable. Again, that person's advice who said to merge with the pain. I think everybody's different, but we all avoid things. Sometimes we avoid the thing that's closest to us and that's hanging over our head, the sword of Damocles or whatever. And I think when you're in a relationship that's disintegrating, there's a part of you that doesn't want to write about it, doesn't want to engage with it. And then when it ends and the hammer actually drops, you can't control it.
When going through that experience and the hammer drops and you can't control it, because I've had a pretty terrible breakup and at times, and I find myself being like, you know, my emotions are like out in the open and I'm like the most annoying. Like in retrospect, I like think about myself and I'm just like the most annoyingly open-hearted, spiritual person in the room. I don't know if you had that experience or not.
I think I talked to my friends' ears off collectively for so often. I leaned so hard on certain friends. I'll always be grateful for their patience and their counsel and their comfort. I'd always write songs to try and make someone else feel better. And I've always been the type of person to be a nurturer to others, I think. And this was the first time I wrote songs to make myself feel better.
All right, let's talk about the haikus. A few years ago, you started putting haikus on your Instagram. So it's like screenshots of like the notepad on an iPhone. Can you explain your reasoning behind using that like image-based platform to share these?
I was a latecomer to Instagram. I think my first gram, I could be mistaken, is 2013 or 2014. I never really got the hang of the selfie. I don't judge anyone else for doing it. I mean, I do for sure, but you know, I try and keep those feelings to myself. I just never really loved sharing images of myself. I like looking at pictures of other people, but myself, I'm the oldest millennial. I'm 1983, so I'm the first year, I think, of the millennials. I think
82. Right,
82.
right
Okay,
here.
Yeah,
I'm the oldest millennial.
You're the oldest. Okay. Well, so yes. So I think I've spoken to others that are like us, and I feel like we have a little bit more self-consciousness, and we remember a little bit too much about what it was like before. So
yeah.
This kind of stuff doesn't come as easy. So I just started thinking about filling up my whole Instagram grid with these little poems that were making me laugh in a very sad time in my life, and were making my friends laugh. And I just liked the idea of it being the haiku is so brief, it's so to the point, and it's so disciplined within its structure. And it just was a fun kind of mental workout. And I also figured that it wouldn't piss too many people off because it's so short that it doesn't take up that much of your time. It's perfect for scrolling through. And I liked the idea of writing what I call dystopian haikus, because the haiku was originally designed by the Japanese masters. They would so somebody gave me a book called Japanese Death Poems, and these are Zen monks on the verge of death writing their last poems. And so I'll read one. So this was written by Hokushi, who died on the 12th day of the 8th month in 1718. I write, erase, rewrite, erase again, and then a poppy blooms. That's like a monk on the verge of death,
Wow.
writing something very beautiful that always involved nature. Haikus are generally meant to evoke nature. I was like, mine should be about brunch and passive aggressively unfollowing your ex like 5 times
Yeah.
in one day.
Oh my God.
Stuff like that. I liked the idea of poems written from the perspective of someone who's trapped inside of a smartphone and cannot escape.
It's really clever and really funny. And that really comes across pretty clear in your haikus, is your sense of humor.
Well, that has to do with this process of becoming comfortable with myself. For many years, I was stuck in what I consider to be a withered archetype of the singer-songwriter, which is a sad white male with hair in his face who just can't fucking stop whining. Those were the people that I admired. Those were the people whose records I collected, and a lot of them have made such great work, but so many of them died prematurely. So many of them led unhappy lives, or lead unhappy lives. And I think for me, I'm just not, as I come to accept who I am, I'm not that. I'm not only that. And I'm pretty much a goofball. And I no longer care who knows it.
Can you talk about working that mix in your humor and like kind of being a goofball into your songwriting? You've talked a lot about how Meet the Mother was your attempt at bringing in that humor, and you do in a really clever way. Was that hard to incorporate humor there without being trite?
I don't think so. I think it's just, again, it's the evolution of being a writer. That song happened very quickly, but it wasn't just sitting around waiting for me to write it. It had to be written after experience. I had to write a bunch of kind of mediocre, serious songs to get to a funny one.
Yeah, can you talk about, you have this really funny quote where you said bad writing is also important. You got to write some real garbage sometimes. Can you make a case for bad writing?
Yeah, I think you got to write a lot. I think, if you're a fisherman, the more you go fishing, the more fish you'll catch. So I think that's true to a certain extent for writers, and the more you write, the more you're going to learn about writing. That's really what I'm talking about. And it's important to write every day, even if it's in your head. Just turn an idea over a couple times or try something. And Meet the Mother came out of a period where I was very, very, as soon as I woke up, before I made coffee, which is very soon after I wake up, before I allowed any substance into my body besides water, I'd write the first thing that came into my head. And I just had my laptop open and typed in whatever stupid phrase was rolling around in my head when I first opened my eyes in the morning. And that's a lot of the Meet the Mother song came out of that exercise.
Reading about your career in Los Angeles, you've spent a lot of time around famous people, working with them and just like being around them. That Meet the Mother song has roots in you talking to Bill Murray at one point. What is your impression of fame and what it does to people?
I think that fame is an incredibly toxic substance that most people are very allergic to. And I think that if you can't get your arms around it'll start running your programs for you, start running your software for you pretty quick. And it probably won't end well, There are some people that I've met that have handled it with incredible grace. And, those people are really sophisticated beings. And there are other people who I've known and loved that are no longer here because of it, and or partially because of it. And I think it most people want to be famous, but most people are very lucky that they're not.
Johnathan, can you talk about the place that you live now?
Sure. I live in Malibu, which, for those of you that are unfamiliar with Los Angeles, it's at the western edge of LA County, and it's basically the beach. and the population of Malibu has stayed pretty much level despite the massive explosion of population in the rest of Los Angeles. It's a pretty level thing. It's pretty much a small, isolated beach town on the edge of Los Angeles. And it's very hard to get here because of the traffic. It's also very hard to leave here because of the traffic. So most of us who live, it's like the Hotel California. So most of us who live here to stay here because it is remarkably, breathtakingly beautiful. And Malibu is the Chumash Indians who lived here. Malibu in their language means where the sea sounds loudly. And I've lived here for a little over a year. And it's been an incredibly beautiful time, but also a very tumultuous time because my girlfriend and I, we were displaced by the Malibu fires in November. And our house didn't burn down, but a lot of our neighborhood did burn down. And many, many homes in this community did burn down. And we've been going through that process. And, it's a massive natural disaster, the biggest in Malibu's history. And it's been really incredible. It's been sad. It's been also very wonderful to see how everyone takes care of each other. But it's been quite a time here.
Stick around. We're going to do the lightning round, and it's going to be great. You ready for it?
I am.
Okay, here we go. We'll be right back. Basic Folk is brought to you in part by Tina and Her Pony, a queer duo bringing traditional Appalachian music and vocal harmonies into the 21st century. Visit tinaandherpony.com. And thanks to WIUP in Indiana, Pennsylvania, which airs Basic Folk 2 p.m. Eastern every Saturday. You can listen on 90.1 if you're in the Indiana, PA area, or at their website, wiupfm.org. Johnathan Rice, are you ready for the lightning round?
I am. How fast do I have to answer stuff?
Not too fast. I mean, like lightning.
But lightning is so fast.
Right.
But it's only a centimeter thick, I heard.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
All right. Well, a centimeter thick is how short your answers will be. Okay, here we go. Dogs or cats or something else?
Dogs.
What is your coffee order?
Pour over.
Favorite U.S. city?
New Orleans.
First album you bought with your own money?
Maybe Michael Jackson's Dangerous?
Beatles or Rolling Stones?
The Rolling Stones.
Morning person or night owl?
Night owl.
Gibson or Fender?
Gibson.
Flying or invisibility?
Invisibility.
Star Trek or Star Wars?
I haven't seen either.
Wow. What is the most beautiful place you've ever visited?
The Scottish Highlands.
Great. Johnathan Rice, you've completed the lightning round. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, this has been great. Thank you. You were so generous with your time. We went over.
Oh, no worries at all. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Basic Folk is produced by Adam Corey and Laura McCarthy. I'm your host, Cindy Howes. Our business manager is Lindsay Myers. Our music done by Alex Stanton of the band Townspeople. And we'll be back next week. In the meantime, if you subscribe to Basic Folk, if you tell people about this episode of the podcast, sign up for the newsletter, or you can sign up for the Facebook group Basic Folk Basics. You can find show notes and all the other episodes at cindyhouse.net. And we'll talk to you next week. Thanks. Bye.